Why the podcast interview is the perfect podcast prescription. It's the Podcast Report, episode 82. Show notes, links, conversation, and more at thepodcastreport.com/82. Okay, who is this guy? What is this show? This guy is Paul Colligan. I am Paul Colligan. You are a podcaster. And this is the show where I show you, the podcaster, how to reach more with your message and profit more from your content. In this episode, I'm actually changing my song a bit. Same musical, same style, but changing my song just a little bit. It's all about the world of podcasting interviews. If you listen to last week's episode 81, you know that I'm going down this path, examining this path, and I want to go a little bit deeper today why I'm doing that. There's a couple of things that I missed about podcast interviews that was always there. I missed them. Maybe you knew them. Maybe you didn't, but that's where we're going to start. So one of the things that's really interesting about podcast interviews is simply that they are easy content. You don't have to be an expert anymore. You just have to be interested. Now, I'm a podcaster, been doing it for over a decade. I've written books. I do consulting. I do a whole bunch of things. So, quote unquote, I might be considered an expert. But the fact of the matter is you don't have to be an expert to do a podcast if you're doing interviews. You just have to be interested. And that is a game changer. That can bring more people into podcasting space. And let's face it, we all have topics we're interested in that we might not be experts on yet. And well, that could make podcasting really interesting. And there are all sorts of additional elements too in doing a podcast interview. One thing that's great is you bring in somebody huge, you bring in somebody big, and if you do it right, they might market you. Of course, another thing that's really interesting about the podcasting space is even if they don't market you, the SEO for bigger names. You know, you attach yourself with a bunch of experts in the field, and when people search for those experts in the field, your name pops up, your podcast pops up. Interesting. The other thing about podcasting is it can be done really quickly, done really fast, if it's done right. So what we have today is I've got a full worksheet for you on everything you need for the perfect podcast interview, how you can take advantage of this podcasting opportunity and do great things with it. If you head out to thepodcastreport.com/82, you can pick up the worksheet. You can use it right now. If you want to hit pause, go over there, pick it up, follow along. But here's what's interesting. Take the worksheet, pin it to your wall, pin it to your board, keep it on reference, keep it on file, and then every time you do an interview, go through all of these steps, and then you can truly leverage all of the things that podcasting brings to you. So that's at thepodcastreport.com/82. But let's talk to the content there. 3 real big ideas that follow in today. Number 1, the properly executed interview is podcast perfection. The properly executed interview is podcast perfection. We've all listened to podcasts, and honestly, this is why I've been kind of negative on the topic where they haven't done their homework, they haven't done their research, and so it's not properly executed. It's a bit of a mess. It's a bit of a muddle. Well, do it right, and you got some podcast perfection. The other thing is your podcast audience is your podcast business. Your podcast audience is your podcast business. Everything you do serves the audience. This is huge. We'll speak to that in a second. And then finally, to that is just simply serve your podcast audience, not your podcast guest. If you bring someone on your show that has an agenda that is not your agenda, not your audience's agenda, you're not doing the right thing. You're not thinking the right way. So let's get to it. The what, the so what, the now what. The what. There is a massive interview podcast genre, if you will. Last week's interview with Jessica Rhodes from Interview Connections. I linked to that as in the show notes, thepodcastreport.com/82. It was funny. Jessica was charming. Initially, I was going to edit up the interview, but there were so many knowledge bombs dropped that I gave you the ability to get access to the entire thing. She runs a multiple 6-figure business, just bringing in folk in and out. She brings in people to be on your show. She helps people, get on shows. Wonderful. She was great. Definitely part of the story. I missed a few things. I've missed a few things in the podcasting space, and I described that earlier. It's easy content. You don't have to be the expert. All sorts of additional elements, and fast if it's done right. And doing it right is the topic for today's episode. That's the one-page cheat sheet at thepodcastreport.com/82, but let's get to that. So on the cheat sheet, you'll see that we've got basically 6 issues: best questions track, SEO elements, WIIFM elements, external engagements, ads, and emails. Let's speak to each one of them. The first one is the best questions track. What do they have to offer? How do they help your audience get there? See, this is huge. You know your audience. You know what your audience wants. You know what your audience is looking for. You know what your audience needs. And if you ask questions of the guest that gives your audience what they need, offers your audience what they're looking for, that's fantastic. If you understand how the guest can bring the audience to where they want to be, that's great. But that means more times than not, and Jessica really pointed to that last week, that your questions are going to be different each time. Unless you're doing something like telling the same story over and over and over again, then it's the same questions over and over and over again. But if you're taking your audience on a journey, if you're taking your followers down the path they want to know, they want to go, you know what it is, and it's your job to ask the questions that gets the audience there. So you bring on an interviewee. What do they have to offer your audience? Not what do they have to offer the world, not what is their new book about, not what is their new podcast about, but what do they have to offer your audience? And that dictates a certain batch of questions. And then how do they help your audience get there? That dictates a certain batch of questions as well. So the first thing is always ask the right questions. The next thing, and this is key, always think SEO. Search engine optimization, and whether or not that search engine is Google, or maybe they're on Bing, or maybe it's iTunes, or maybe it's Google Play, or maybe it's some podcasting element that we don't know of at the time of recording, but someone's listening to this and going, what about that guy? That's the one. You want to think in terms of SEO. And you want to think in terms of 4 elements for SEO. Number 1, what's the episode title? Do people know what that episode is about by the title? Of course, if your episode is called episode 42 with Frank Johnson, they have no idea what it's about. But if it's learn how to basket weave for fun and profit with Frank Johnson, episode 82, that's an entirely different thing. So they need to know what it is from the title. They need to know what it is from bullets. Some people like bullets, and some of your marketing is going to be bullets, and your website and maybe email copy, these things are going to be bullets. Sometimes it's going to be descriptions. So you want to have clear bullets and you want to have clear descriptions. And then finally, show notes. Those have to be good. Those have to be SEO. That has to be the terms of what your audience is looking for. And remember, the show notes are in the feed for people who are searching that way, and the show notes are at the site for people who are searching that way. So when you're thinking SEO, think about the episode title, think about clear bullets, think about clear descriptions, think about show notes for both the feed and the site. The next thing is, and this is the one place where radio is good for podcasting, is you got to think WIIFM. What is in it for me? Okay. Why does your audience want to listen to this episode? Right now, if you are this far into the episode, you are interested in the world of doing interviews and you want to know how to do them perfectly, and you are looking for the recipe, and that is what I've given you right now. You have the recipe. You can go to the website to download it, print it off, and you got the commentary in this episode. It's there. What's in it for me? And what's in it for me has to be in the episode title, has to be in the show notes, has to be in the bullets, has to be in the descriptions, because this is where they might be looking. You don't know how they're going to find you. You just know that when they find you, you want to make it sure it works. So yes, there's SEO, but there's also what's in it for me. Now, the next thing is external engagement. One theme to this show, and if you've started here, I really recommend that you go back and look to past episodes. The best monetization for a podcast is not ad insertion, or at least ad insertion for third-party ads. It's the sales of your own content or products and services that you are associated and affiliated with, which means you have to get engagement outside of the podcast. And you have to give them a reason to be engaged outside of the podcast. It's external engagement. And that's done with the episode lead magnet. Here at this episode, I'm bringing those really interested into interviews external to the podcast, outside of the podcast, by visiting the website and downloading the checklist. I've also got content here that could be multicasted, could be part of a book, could be part of a blog post. One of the things you're going to get if you go to thepodcastreport.com/82 is a transcript of today's episode, because today's episode is so important. External engagement, episode lead magnets, multicast, and or tracking. The next thing you need are the ads. There are not a small batch are going to come from your podcast because they find you. A small batch is going to come to your podcast because they have, engaged, or maybe they're looking for you or that type of thing. But most of the people are going to come to the podcast because you told them. Now, that could be social media. That could be email. That could be ads in other people's newsletters. That could be ads at your website, but they're going to come because of ads. You see, your podcast audience is your podcast business. It's not iTunes' job to bring you listeners. It's not Google Play's job to bring you listeners. It's not Stitcher's job to bring you listeners. It's your job. And you've got to produce ads that bring people to the show. Every time I launch an ad for the show, I get more listeners than when I do the normal publish for the subscribers or the normal search engine optimization. The majority of it comes from ads, and you want to produce those ads. And you want to do them to the SEO, and you want to do them to the what's in it for me, and you want to do them to the external engagement, but you have to produce these ads. The last thing you need is a batch of emails. The first batch of email is obviously the audience ads because, well, let's face it, that's where it all happens, and that is your business. Your podcast audience is your podcast business. But then a couple other things. If you're working with guests, they don't know you. They don't know your style. They don't know how you work. You want to confirm with your guests once you've set it up when you're going to do the interview. How does that email go? If you know the guest, if they're a friend of yours, if they're an associate of yours, that's easy to get. But if you don't know the guest, how do you recruit for the guest? What email do you send to introduce yourself? These issues you want to write. And then, of course, guest thank you. When people come on board, thank them for what they've done. Respond to the effort that they gave your show and how. Because you led them down the best questions track. They gave your audience what they are looking for. They helped your audience get to where it is that you're going. You follow up with a thank you like that, and you got a much better chance of, as I spoke to earlier, them marketing you, them thanking you, them maybe recommending you to someone else. So all those emails need to get done. So if you are going to do an interview podcast or bring interviews, make sure the best questions are there. Make sure the SEO elements are there. Make sure the WIIFM elements are in there. Examine your external engagement, write ads that bring people in, and then make sure that you send all of the best emails. That's the so what. The so what was big, but let's get to the now what. Now what? With this list, with this prescription, I want you to consider interviews. It is a viable entity if you do it correctly. And you don't have to be the expert, and you don't have to come up with content every week, and you don't have to know everything, and you don't have to know the trends and all these things. You can get these from your audience. It's great. Run your interviews up against this prescription. Grab the worksheet, thepodcastreport.com/82. And then the last thing is maybe consider some help, because if you are the voice, definitely you have to do the interview. If you are the owner of this, if you are the brain behind this, obviously the right questions, you got to worry about that. The SEO elements, especially the WIIFM elements, need to be there for you, but consider some help here. You can hand this off to someone else. Last week, you met Jessica, who is you can hand off to the finding of guests, but you still have the questions to ask. You still have the elements of both SEO and WIIFM. You can hand that out to someone else. Make sure it's someone who knows your business. Make sure it's nobody who make sure that it is somebody who you know, like, and trust. There is a link in the episode show notes to the podcast interviewwizard.com. We've put together a tool that puts together some of this. If you head out there before the live presentation, you'll get a ticket to the live presentation. If you go there after the live presentation, you'll be able to get an access to the video and see what we do. If you can attend live, it would be great because we're actually going to pull somebody from the audience and go through all of these elements using the tool. It's going to be pretty fabulous. But anyway, consider interviews, run your interviews up against this prescription, consider getting some help, either handing it off to someone else or using a tool like the podcastinterviewwizard.com. There we go. That is the perfect podcast interview prescription. I'll hit it again. Best questions track, SEO elements, WIIFM elements, external engagement, ads, and emails. If you want the worksheet with these and the bullets, thepodcastreport.com/82. All right, this has been the Podcast Report. This is season 2. We're trying some new things. We're doing things a little bit differently. We've tried elements. We've tried production models. We've tried different things. Today is me in the good microphone. That should make you happy, Dave Jackson. Dave, you know what it is that I'm talking about. Love your input on the show, season 2, what we're doing, what you like, what you don't like. If you head out to thepodcastreport.com/82, you can make a comment to the specific episode. You can, of course, go to thepodcastreport.com/Twitter or thepodcastreport.com/Facebook or thepodcastreport.com/whatever you want for the social platform of your choice. Again, if you head out to thepodcastreport.com/82, I got a bunch of links for you. I've got a link to thepodcastinterviewwizard.com. Again, it's an invite if we haven't gone live yet. It's a replay if it has already happened. We will pick somebody from the audience and go through all of this. It's going to be a lot of fun. I do have a link to the interview with Jessica from Interview Connections last week episode. Definitely take a look at that. I've got a link to the How to Podcast book. If you have not yet podcast, and now this whole interview world is fascinating, but first you got to figure out how to get your podcast out the door. The link to the new version of the book is there as well. And then, of course, the two apps, the How to Podcast app and the Podcast Report app, where you can get all these episodes, is also at the site. And of course, we got the option to exchange the email address for the copy of the worksheet. If you have not subscribed to the show, please consider subscribing to the show. One of the powers of podcasting is that we don't have to reach you every week. We don't have to look to the ads and that kind of thing. The best listener subscribes. And when the listener subscribes, the episode comes automatically to you. And we've got more stuff coming. We've got more great things in the pipeline. And I want to share these with you. And that will come if you subscribe to the show. So that's at thepodcastreport.com/iTunes if you're an iTunes user. If you're one of those Stitcher types, guess what? Yes, it's thepodcastreport.com/Stitcher. If you are a Microsoft phone user, maybe it's thepodcastreport.com/TuneIn. And of course, any other platform that's out there, we are there. Click the slash. If the slash is not there, if we don't have a platform you're interested in, let us know in the comments and we will go from there. Thanks so much for the podcast report. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being my audience. Pick up the worksheet, consider interviews, head out to the podcastinterviewwizard.com, and I'll chat with you next week. Thank you so much. Talk soon. Bye.